Judge's own son faced a historic punishment after ignoring his father's example. "Do you really think this will matter?" he said, sliding a hand through his perfectly styled hair, his voice carrying more amusement than concern. The courthouse doors loomed ahead, and yet he moved like a man stepping onto a red carpet. His suit gleamed under the morning sun, each cufflink a small declaration: money, power, immunity. He smirked at the cluster of cameras snapping relentless photos, waving dismissively at clerks who looked up and quickly away, as if acknowledging a minor celebrity but fearing the wrong glance could summon trouble. Behind him, an entourage hustled like shadows, carrying briefcases, phones, in a sense of untouchable entitlement. Whispers followed him down the marbled hallways. "That's Caprio's boy," one clerk muttered. "Good luck to the judge keeping him in line." Even seasoned bailiffs exchanged glances, their faces a mix of amusement and apprehension. The irony was thick in the air. Everyone in that courthouse knew Judge Caprio's reputation for fairness, for unflinching authority, but here was his own son, striding in with the kind of arrogance only privilege breeds, as if the law were a plaything. He paused at the top of the grand staircase, turning to grin at the press. Flashbulbs exploded. A half-laugh, half-sneer escaped him. "Hope you're ready for a show," he said. And the words weren't just about the cameras. They were about the story he believed he was already winning. In that instant, the tension tightened around him like a vice. Privilege and recklessness collided, setting the stage for a reckoning that no amount of wealth or lineage could escape. Every eye in the building caught him, and yet beneath the surface a question lingered, unspoken but palpable. Could arrogance ever withstand justice when it wore the face of its own father? "Honestly, what's the worst that could happen?" he said, leaning against the marble railing, glancing at the courthouse steps like they were a minor inconvenience. His friends laughed, phones raised to capture the moment, each clip a testament to carelessness and bravado. Social media posts earlier that week had already mocked authority, celebrating a reckless stunt that had spiraled far beyond anyone's expectation. It had started as a simple thrill, an impulsive wager on a financial gamble he barely understood, a party that ended in chaos, a contract ignored, a regulation dismissed. The consequences, once distant shadows, now stretched before him in glaring headlines, in lawsuits and lives disrupted. Workers left unpaid, investors scrambling, reputations tarnished, not just his own, but those tethered to his decisions. He smirked at a group of reporters clustered near the doors. "This is going to be a breeze," he said, the words rolling off his tongue with practiced confidence. A hush rippled through the courthouse staff who had overheard, a mix of disbelief and warning. Privilege had blinded him, and arrogance had convinced him immunity was guaranteed. The truth of what he had done was heavy, but he wore it like an accessory, untouchable in his mind, shielded by the shadow of his father's legacy. Yet beneath the bravado, the cracks were forming, subtle and unseen, signaling that this recklessness was about to meet a force far greater than wealth or influence, a force that demanded accountability, a reckoning the young man had never considered. "Mr. Caprio," he said, offering a half-smile, a casual nod that barely disguised his condescension. "Good to see you." The judge looked at him, and the room seemed to pause. There was no warmth, no recognition, only the calm, unyielding weight of authority. Judge Caprio's gaze swept over him like a scale, measuring every ounce of arrogance, every attempt at entitlement, and found it wanting. "You may rise," the judge said, his voice steady, precise, carrying the quiet insistence of someone who commands a room without raising it. The son straightened in his seat, adjusting his designer tie, a gesture meant to reclaim control, but it felt hollow under that gaze. The opening statements began. Lawyers spoke in measured tones, outlining the consequences of reckless decisions, public harm, financial mismanagement. The trail of disruption left in the wake of privilege unchecked. The sun shifted, smirk fading, fingers drumming nervously on the polished surface before him. His confidence, once so absolute, wavered in the presence of earned authority. Observers in the courtroom exchanged glances. Privilege alone could not match discipline, experience, or the weight of responsibility. Every glance, every subtle movement in the room reinforced the disparity between the inherited power of a name and the authority earned through dedication and moral rigor. A hush settled over the room, a charged silence heavy with anticipation. The first challenge had been issued. The arrogance that had carried him so far now faced its first undeniable obstacle, and for the first time, the possibility of real reckoning hovered in the air, unspoken but unmistakable. "Did you really think no one would see this?" a prosecutor asked, holding up a tablet. Screens lit with emails, messages, and video clips. One after another, the chain of reckless decisions unfolded. Choices made for thrill, convenience, or ego, with no thought for the people left exposed. There was the video of a construction site left dangerously unattended, equipment teetering over the edge, workers shouting warnings that went unheard. There were emails mocking regulators, boasting about bending rules, and dismissive notes to staff that revealed total disregard for safety and responsibility. Witness after witness came forward, voices trembling, eyes sharp with memory. They told of fear, of late nights spent covering for mistakes, of clients losing trust and livelihoods collapsing because one man thought a name could shield him from accountability. The son's smirk faltered, a twitch at the corner of his mouth. His hands gripped the edge of the table. He forced a laugh, trying to dismiss it, but even his own entourage shifted uneasily. The weight of reality pressed in, undeniable and inescapable. "You understand the severity here, don't you?" the prosecutor said, leaning slightly forward, gaze fixed. "This isn't just paperwork or minor infractions. Real people suffered because of choices made with arrogance and ignorance." Murmurs echoed through the courtroom. The audience leaned forward, drawn into the stark revelation. Even allies who had laughed off earlier warnings now exchanged concerned glances. Every image, every testimony, chipped away at the illusion of invulnerability. And with each revelation, the veneer of superiority began to crack. By the time the last witness spoke, recounting sleepless nights and lost opportunities caused by his recklessness, the courtroom was silent. Even the son's usual posture of dominance could not hide the tremor in his hands, the slight narrowing of his eyes, the sudden hesitation that betrayed inner conflict. The arrogance that had carried him into the courtroom now seemed fragile, fragile against the weight of undeniable truth. "Do you even understand the cost of your choices?" Judge Caprio's voice cut through the murmur of the courtroom, steady, unyielding. The question hung in the air, not as an inquiry, but as a moral mirror held up to the young man before him. I made mistakes, yes, but," the son began, trying to shape his words into charm, a half-smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, as if a smirk could soften the weight of what he'd done. "Mistakes?" the judge interrupted, his gaze cold, precise. "You call endangering lives, destroying livelihoods, and mocking authority mistakes? These are failures of character, failures of conscience. You were given guidance, examples, and opportunity, yet you chose recklessness, arrogance, and disregard." The son opened his mouth again, fumbling, grasping at excuses. "I didn't mean for—" "Intent is irrelevant when harm is inevitable," the judge said. "Privilege does not grant immunity from morality. Wealth does not excuse negligence. Influence does not erase responsibility." The courtroom seemed to shrink, every word reverberating, magnifying the weight of the moment. Friends and allies shifted uncomfortably. Even his own lawyer, who had attempted to soften the narrative, fell silent under the piercing clarity of the truth. "You believed a name would shield you," Judge Caprio continued, voice unwavering. "You believed that my example, my reputation, would erase the consequences of your choices. But accountability is not selective, and justice does not bend for arrogance. Every decision carries weight. Every action leaves a mark. And today that reckoning is here." The son's deflections faltered. His charm, once effortless, now felt hollow. He glanced at the faces in the courtroom, workers, victims, colleagues, faces that reflected fear, frustration, and betrayal. The realization sank in. Privilege was not protection. It was exposure. I didn't see it that way," he whispered, a crack in the facade. a tremor in the shielded confidence he had wielded so long. "Perhaps now," the judge said softly, yet with unwavering authority, "you begin to see the measure of responsibility and the cost of moral blindness. Arrogance is temporary, integrity is permanent, and every action carries consequences." The courtroom was silent, each word lingering, reverberating. The son's eyes flickered between defiance and shame, the first true recognition of failure in both legal and moral terms. The moral reckoning had arrived, and it was more piercing than any legal sentence could ever be. The stage was set. The moment of judgment, the verdict that would reconcile arrogance with accountability, loomed inevitable. After careful consideration of the evidence, testimony, and the moral implications of this case, Judge Caprio began, his voice deliberate and unflinching. "The court finds that accountability extends beyond the letter of the law. It reaches the very conscience of those who wield privilege without regard." The son's jaw tightened, a flicker of unease crossing his face, as though the weight of expectation, once invisible, had suddenly become tangible. "Therefore," the judge continued, "it is the judgment of this court that the defendant shall make full restitution to those directly harmed by his actions, not as a mere transaction of money, but as acknowledgement of real consequences, real pain, and real lives affected." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Some exhaled in relief, others in astonishment. The sentence did not merely punish, it demanded recognition of moral failure. "In addition," the judge said, pausing to let the words settle, "the defendant shall undergo a structured program of accountability and community engagement, ensuring that his privilege is redirected towards service, learning, and restitution." The son's shoulders slumped imperceptibly, disbelief etched across his features. He muttered under his breath, This can't be real." "It is real," Judge Caprio replied, calm but absolute, "and it is necessary. Let this judgment serve as both consequence and lesson. No inheritance of power shields one from responsibility. No name can erase the cost of negligence." The courtroom exhaled in collective acknowledgement. Friends and colleagues shifted uneasily. Even those who had once assumed his charm would protect him understood that the reckoning had arrived. As the gavel struck, the room seemed to exhale the tension it had held for hours. The son's eyes met the judge's. No smirk, no deflection, just the dawning realization of the gravity he had ignored for so long. He had learned finally that arrogance, no matter how shielded by wealth or name, could never withstand the moral clarity of justice. Outside the courtroom, whispers spoke of the historic nature of the judgment. Some called it harsh, others called it overdue. But all understood the same truth. Entitlement has a cost, and accountability, when wielded with integrity, restores balance in ways that neither money nor influence can erase. The son left the courtroom changed, a figure diminished yet confronted by possibility. The possibility of real understanding, real remorse, and the slow, deliberate path toward redemption. Justice, at last, had been done. Headlines flashed across screens. Judge's son held accountable. Privilege meets consequence. A historic lesson in responsibility. Social media erupted in threads dissecting every detail, from the recklessness that sparked the case to the unprecedented firmness of Judge Caprio's sentence. Opinions collided. Some criticized the severity, claiming wealth should protect influence. Others praised the verdict as a rare triumph of principle over power. Inside, the son could no longer hide behind charm or a name. Friends avoided calls, colleagues whispered in hallways, and every public mention carried judgment. He felt the weight of gazes that were once indifferent. The world had watched him stumble, and this time, no inherited reputation could cushion the fall. He replayed the courtroom in his mind, the measured words of his father echoing relentlessly. No inheritance of power shields one from responsibility. For the first time, the phrase pierced through arrogance, revealing the emptiness of entitlement and the gravity of actions ignored. The community he had once taken lightly now measured him in consequences. Families impacted by his negligence were no longer abstract. Their loss, fear, and frustration were tangible and undeniable. Even fleeting glances at news segments brought a stark, unavoidable reality. The world expected accountability, and justice had not just spoken, it had demanded action. Strained relationships reminded him that wealth could not buy trust back, that charm could not undo neglect, and that reputation, when tested, meant little against moral failure. He began to understand that integrity is earned, maintained, and defended, not inherited, and that the first step toward redemption was acknowledgement without excuse. The public continued to debate, but the lesson resonated quietly in those who paid attention. Arrogance may soar under privilege, but it cannot withstand ethical clarity. Responsibility, once embraced, transforms the individual. Once ignored, it humbles even the most sheltered. As the weeks unfolded, he faced a world no longer inclined to coddle him. And in that quiet reckoning, there emerged the echo of something rarer than punishment: reflection. The arrogance that had opened the door to scandal now met its mirror, and in the stillness, the long shadow of justice lingered, a reminder that entitlement carries weight and that true accountability reshapes more than public perception. It reshapes the soul.